So part of the reason for this shift is this guy, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a Democrat. Okay, well, Democrats, in theory, are supposed to believe in small government. They're supposed to believe in states' rights over federal rights, and they're supposed to be from the South. Roosevelt didn't believe that at all. So first off, Roosevelt was from the North. He was from New York, and he was from this family of WASPs. So they could trace their family lineage back through the colonial era. And this was a really, really wealthy family. Now, Roosevelt identified as Democrat, but he believed that the government should be there to protect the people, that it shouldn't be very limited in nature. Well, in order to do that, the government, according to Roosevelt and to people like him, has to be bigger. It can't be very, very small. It has to be bigger. So when the Great Depression starts, the initial response was, well, we're going to keep the government out of it. We'll let the markets do what they want. Okay, things will work themselves out. And Roosevelt's predecessor, Herbert Hoover, was like, the role of the government is not to get involved. We're going to leave it that way. Well, the Depression kind of gets worse. And people are starving. They are being evicted. Things are getting really bad. So when Roosevelt is elected in 1933, he comes in and he says, okay, well, the role of the government isn't to stay out of people's lives. The role of the federal government is to help the people. And he wins by a landslide. People were just so angry at Hoover, who was running for re-election, they didn't even really consider him to be a viable candidate. And so Roosevelt is elected by a landslide. And so even though he's a Democrat, he starts to grow the federal government and say, okay, we are going to have all of these different types of, what's the word I want to use? These different types of welfare programs that I'll talk about on the next slide that are there to help the people. Now, it didn't matter where you were from. It didn't matter what your politics were. It was very much, okay, we are starving. We need help. Please, please, President Roosevelt, help us. And everyone supported him. Now, a lot of the reason Roosevelt kind of gets away with what he does is because of his personality. He develops what's called a personality cult or a cult of leadership. Roosevelt was, like, I don't know how to describe it. He was so charismatic. And he knew how to relate to people. And he knew how to relate to people in a way where even if they were worried about what he was doing, he could persuade them otherwise. So one of the ways he does this is through his fireside chats. Roosevelt recognized that some people would say, I don't like how the federal government is growing. So he decides to have conversations with them that are aired over the radio, in which he explains what is going on, why he's doing what he's doing. And these he called fireside chats. Now, by this point in history, we have the radio, which you saw on a previous slide. And the radio creates a new connection with between the people and their leaders. And Roosevelt knows this, and he uses it to make it seem like he is there talking with you one-on-one. And people are like, oh, wow. He's like, for the first time ever really in American history, people feel like their politicians aren't just some people far, far away doing whatever they want, but are real humans that are there, that are supporting them, that are, I have to say this over and over, that are humans like them. And Roosevelt uses this to develop his personality cult because he's just so charismatic. And so people start to follow him. On the slide, I have a link to the first fireside chat. Please listen to it and reflect upon Roosevelt's tone and how he's talking about what's going on in this era. So the New Deal has a lot of impacts that we still see today. So first off is Social Security, which may or may not stay around. Social Security was based upon the idea that, okay, you have a working life, and when you reach a certain age, 65, you're allowed to retire. This idea of retirement is really new. People usually didn't retire. You just kept working until you died. Well, the idea of Social Security was you pay in to the government and you give them money, and when you're ready to retire, you get money back as a form of income, so you can basically live your life without having to work. This had never been thought of, and it relies on having Social Security numbers, which we have now. This did not come, the idea of having a Social Security number is new to the New Deal, the 1930s. And some people were kind of freaked out about this, but most went, hey, I'm fine with retiring and not having to work the rest of my life. Sure. And they paid in. Another impact of the New Deal is the idea of the welfare state, which I talked about on the previous slide. The idea that the government has a right for has the duty to help and support people who are struggling in their lives. After the New Deal and after World War II, the welfare state and the role of the government in people's everyday lives to support them if they need it is going to expand dramatically, particularly in the 1960s through today. If Roosevelt came back from the dead and saw what the government did to support people today, he would be like, wow, I never thought of that. This is bigger government than I even could have imagined. He actually would probably be a little terrified of it, to be brutally honest. But that's an impact of the New Deal. Finally is government bailouts. And I'm using the term government bailouts both in a very broad sense. So one sense is government bailouts of the industries. So for example, the automotive industry and the airline industry and there was another industry recently, that when everyone is struggling within that industry, they will go to the government and the government says, okay, well, here's money. Don't lay off everyone. Keep going. That's a government bailout, and that's actually an impact of the New Deal. Roosevelt would have hated that. Actually, maybe not. He liked industry more than he wanted people to know. But that wasn't what he wanted the New Deal to be. But you can also use the term government bailout to think about what happened during COVID, where the government went, oh, wow, so many people are laid off. Okay, here's extra money, here's extra money, here's extra money. To make sure that there are times where life just kind of falls apart. Okay, if people are being laid off, we'll give everyone a bit of extra money. COVID's not the only time this had happened. There was a major recession. It was a depression in 2008, and the government also gave people money from that as well. And that's an impact of the New Deal. The idea of the government giving money just had never happened before. So under Roosevelt, we see a major shift, the rise of the government. And we started talking about this in the 1920s, with the idea that the government is starting to expand with prohibition and the first Red Scare. And in the 1920s, it's seen as kind of a bad thing. People are like, wait a minute, I don't support prohibition. You're telling me that I can't drink? Are you kidding me? With the first Red Scare, people were, yeah, they loved it or you hated it. Many people critiqued the first Red Scare as either being authoritarian or, what's the word I'm looking for? Or as as undermining the Constitution, particularly freedom of speech. Other people said, no, the rise of the government should be there to protect us, and that's what it's doing. Now, in the 1930s, with the rise of the government, what we start to see is the beginning of the welfare state. The welfare state is the idea that the government is there to protect the people. That if you are struggling, if you cannot support yourself, the government should be there to help you in some form or another. Now, this is new in history. I cannot emphasize this enough. And it's not just unique to America. Countries in Europe are actually doing the exact same thing right around the time of the 1930s and 1920s and 1930s. The welfare state goes against what the founding fathers had wanted because they believed that if you're struggling, well, your local town should help you. Or maybe not really even your local state, it should be your local town should help you. The idea that the government, the federal government, should help you was foreign to them because they lived in a world where if you struggled, your neighbors helped. But that was very different. That was a very different situation from the 1930s. More people are living in the cities. People are living in areas where they don't know their neighbors. Moreover, everyone is struggling in the 1930s. Nobody's really able to help anybody because of the Great Depression. So this leads to the rise of the federal government to support people and when they need help, the welfare state. And we do it through the New Deal, which Roosevelt promotes. Now, the New Deal is not actually Roosevelt's brain baby. It actually comes from female reformers. All of the New Deal policies, Roosevelt didn't actually think of them. These all came from either his wife or from female reformers who had been working for labor reform, childcare reform, education reform during the Progressive Era and the Gilded Age era. Roosevelt actually put many of these women on to government posts for the first time in history. This was amazing because he said, you know what needs to be done to help people? Maternalism, basically. You're going to help me expand the welfare state. So we do. And we start to see the idea that the government should be there to help the people. The New Deal develops a variety of programs to help people who are struggling. One of them is the Works Progress Administration, which there's actually an image on the slide that says Work Pays America, WPA, Works Progress Administration, which was there to help men who were struggling. The CCC I mentioned earlier, the Civilian Conservation Corps, which was for young men, mainly young men who were not married, or young men who had young families, to go out and have jobs. Now, most of the New Deal programs were focused in on men. Very few of them supported working women. The New Deal actually told working women to go home and leave jobs for men. And it's kind of funny when you think about it because during the Great Depression, when we talk about the mass unemployment during the Great Depression, most women kept their jobs. And most women were the sole supporters of their family. The New Deal programs were actually designed to make sure women went back into the household, or what they said women should go into the household, because women have never actually been in the household, and that men should be the providers. So it's interesting because the government was actually trying to get involved with separate spheres mentality, which had not gone away through New Deal programs. In reality, some women benefited from New Deal programs, but most of them will actually hold jobs outside of the New Deal programs. Either way, the New Deal and the idea of the welfare state start the rise and the expansion of the federal government.